Yes. Hello, everyone. My name is Rojin Belgane from Frontier Lab Americas. I'm the technical director covering US and Canada for Frontier Laboratories. I started my profession as an analytical chemist in a laboratory, working with multiple analytical instrumentation such as FTIR and, of course, Frontier Pi GCMS. I was doing material characterization, polymer identification, and also contamination analysis for the samples that were coming in from the field. So I have a very good hands-on with the actual pyrolysis GCMS instrumentation. As a former Frontier user, I'm also very passionate about providing technical support to our users and kind of creating product awareness about Frontier Lab.
Awesome. Thanks, Rojin. And finally, but definitely not our least favorite, we have Sonia here, one of our customers, an actual user of the pyrolysis system. Sonia, do you want to introduce yourself?
Yep. Hi, everyone. Good afternoon. I'm Sonia Addis. I work at Cooper Tire and Rubber Company in Findlay, Ohio. I've been there for a little over 3.5 years now. I came in with actually zero experience in pyrolysis GCMS, some experience in GC and GCMS, but the pyrolysis inlet was actually very new to me. So I've been working in pyrolysis about 3.5 years then, the longevity of my time at Cooper. And I have to say it's by far my favorite analytical tool that we have in our analytical lab. And I'll say that I also run all of our chromatography equipment. So I do HPLC, GPC, GC, FID. Then I also run our microscopy lab as well. So I do SEM, EDX. I do different metrology analysis, fine particle analysis, elemental analysis. I do a lot. And pyrolysis is by far my favorite and probably the tool, my go-to tool for a lot of reasons that hopefully I'll make clear to you today. So yeah,
awesome.
I'm really happy to be
thanks
here.
Everyone. Thanks everyone. First of all, thanks to everyone who's attending, and thanks so much for our speakers. So let's go ahead and get started. We've got some great discussion topics today. Pyrolysis systems. Some pyrolysis systems on the market, so we thought it would be good to start with that. And I'm going to give this one to Rojin. Do you want to start off on this topic?
Sure, definitely. So as you mentioned, Nicole, there are multiple, mainly 3 different pyrolyzer systems in the market currently. One of them is a filament type pyrolyzer. They use a cold wire technology, and then microfurnace, which is a technology Frontier is using this as a patented technology for us, and that uses a low mass ceramic furnace that heats and cools pretty quickly. And then, of course, we have Curry Point pyrolyzer, which are the traditional ones, and there are not too many of them in North America, and they use a ferromagnetic foil. So what really makes the Frontier setting apart from the other pyrolyzer in the market, one of the main advantages of it is the reproducibility that you obtain from the microfurnace design. Sample introduction is nearly instantaneous. You actually place your sample into your sample cup, and you hold it in an ambient temperature before the analysis starts. Once you set your furnace to the desired temperature, and once that furnace is set to that temperature, which is also measured with a thermocouple sensor, the cup pre-falls into your furnace, into your quartz tube, where it gets pyrolyzed quickly and reproducibly. And then all the pyrolysates, as they're getting generated, they get deposited on your GC column directly and continuously. So you're performing a single step, one step type pyrolysis. Also, another benefit is the fact that the pyrolyzer with microfurnace, you connect it directly to your GC injection port. There is no transfer line. You're not going to deal with any active site or cross-contamination from that transfer line. Another actually advantage I can think of is about comparing a little bit of technology between filament and microfurnace. With some of the filament pyrolyzers, you perform a 2-step analysis, which means there's first of all a transfer line from the pyrolyzer into your GC injection port. But once you pyrolyze the sample, you trap and you focus them on a chemical trap. And then using switching valves, you send all these pyrolysates through a long transfer line to your GC injection port. So as you can imagine, it's a long commute for your pyrolysates to get to your GC column. Some of those polars and heavy pyrolysates could stick irreversibly on the transfer line or on your chemical trap, so you won't be able to analyze a full range of your volatiles, light, all the way to the heavy and polar components of your samples. These are the main advantages that I could think of the microfurnace.
Great. Alan, did you have something that you wanted to add to that?
Yeah, I think one of the biggest takeaways from Rogin's points, and I think for us, is the fact that it does sit right on top of our GCMS inlet, right? And what this does is it frees up a lot of different things. For us, at least, hardware configurations, which we're going to touch on, I think, in a little bit later portion of this webinar, but just basically giving us the space to have multiple different techniques. So something that's not purely a pyrolysis instrument, giving us the flexibility for multiple sample analysis types. Something else that I think this really benefits from is the overall maintenance. There's very limited maintenance with a micro furnace. It's usually you set it up and you run it, and it's like Rogin had mentioned, it's very consistent, it's repeatable, and that's kind of necessary if you're getting into kind of more of the quantitative side of pyrolysis. I know a lot of customers feel that they kind of shy away from quantitative analysis with pyrolysis, but just using the microfurnace itself alone, without any of the other accessories, just having that microfurnace does give you the ability for a little bit more comfort in quantitative analysis.
Awesome. Great. Kind of following up off of that, so we see that there's different types. I've been told that you can use the pyrolyzer for a couple different analytical type methods. Rogin, would you like to kind of expand on kind of its methods and use cases?
Sure. So as you mentioned, Nicole, this pyrolyzer microfurnace is not a traditional pyrolyzer where you could only run it for flash pyrolysis or fast pyrolysis. With the microfurnace, you have multiple modes of operation. So you have one instrument by GCMS using microfurnace, but you have multiple modes of operation that you could use, such as evolved gas analysis, which stand for EGA, thermal desorption, of course, which is the thermal extraction, hard cutting, thermal slicing, or a double shot, which is thermal extraction followed by flash pyrolysis, as well as flash pyrolysis, of course. So typically, when you receive a sample, it could be completely unknown. You have no idea what the sample is about. The first step for you to do material characterization is to use your evolved gas analysis, EGA modes of operation. So think of EGA as something that gives you a clear picture about the thermal complexity and thermal profile of your sample. Very similar to your TGA, thermal gravimetric analysis, but with EGA, you have the chemical composition versus the detector response, in this case, MS or FID. Once you run your EGA, then you can set the next step to see, would I need to do a thermal desorption? Do I want to extract additives thermally, and what will be that optimal temperature zone from my EGA? Do I want to perform a hard cutting? So really that EGA is the first step that you would need to run. And then following EGA, you'll set the next step and you perform any of the separation analysis, such as flash pyrolysis, double shot or hard cutting, or actually reactive pyrolysis as well. But the EGA is a thermal separation as your first step.
Great. Alan, I know we see a lot of people use a lot of different styles. What other things do people need to keep in mind with these analytical methods in regards to, like, where would you even start?
I think that's a great point. In one of the nice things about pyrolysis is the flexibility in having those 4 analytical methods. I think one thing to keep in mind is that no sample is alike. So starting in one place for a certain sample might not start you off in the exact same place for another set of samples. And I think having the ability to switch between those 4 analytical methods is what gives the pyrolysis such a huge advantage when it's added to a GCMS, just because we can really break down whatever the sample is we're running with a variety of methods here. So obviously the place to start would be your EGA method, because that's going to give you exactly what Rogine had mentioned. That's going to show you the entire thermogram of not only the volatiles, the additives, but the polymers as well. Not only is it going to give you that information, but it's also going to give you the temperature information, so you're not shooting in the dark for what type of temperature ramps you should be looking for or what pyrolysis step you should be looking for. There are a lot of pyrolysis applications out there that have predetermined methods, and those are always a great place to start as well, if it's a basic double shot or it's a heart cut analysis method. But again, not all samples are alike, and there may be different variables that are introduced that you may just benefit more from starting from scratch, starting with the EGA and working your way up towards either a single shot, double shot, followed up by the heart cutting, which would be kind of your most complex and most versatile method. But I think EGA is always a great place to start, and there's so much information that you can derive from just the EGA method alone that proves the pyrolysis technique proves its worth. So
awesome. Sonia, did you want to add something there?
Yeah, I just want to add to that a little bit, because there are a lot of things that you can do, and I love the flow chart of the EGA, followed by, really optimizing your methods and deciding what works best for your sample. And for optimizing quantitative analysis and really specific applications, that's definitely the route. But what I love about this system is you can get really quick answers really fast. Without even going through all of that. You can have some of these pre-prepared programs, like Alan already mentioned, kind of in your toolbox. Maybe you don't have the time to really run the EGA or to optimize the next step or conduct the heart cut, but you can get so many practical answers so quickly with some really generic methods. And then that can lead you later to optimize when you do have time. But there's a lot that you can do in a really short period of time with all of these tools.
Awesome. And that actually segues really well into our next discussion point, which is, and I'm going to start with Alan, because he kind of came in with GCMS experience and then learned the pyrolyzer going forward. But what are some advantages of pyrolysis as a technique? Like, why should someone who maybe already has a GC or a GCMS even consider adding this to their toolbox?
Well, I think mainly it just opens up a whole new realm of samples that you can actually introduce into your GC and GCMS. So when you think about GC and GCMS, you're looking obviously at gas chromatography, so anything on the lighter end, the volatiles and things like that. But it's not always easy to get the samples that you want into the GCMS. And I think, that's one of the huge benefits of the PY technique, is it allows you to take those complex samples and get that onto your GCMS for then separation and identification. And I mean, one of the things that, I didn't really realize at first, and then was kind of had my eyes open to it, was there's certain things that you can actually take from other techniques and apply it to PY GCMS. And one of those things would be like a TGA, if we're looking at that type of analysis. If you think about the pyrolysis being just a furnace, right? And we're increasing the temperatures, and certain things are going to come off at certain temperatures. We can kind of pseudo apply that to GCMS, but also add that extra power of identification there as well. So as those things come off and desorb off, we now have the power of the mass spec to actually, qualitatively figure out what they are, and also provide some quantitative analysis as well.
And I see Sonia there definitely shaking her head. Did you want to add to that, Sonia?
Yeah, I mean, opening the door to all kinds of different samples is pretty much everything. So we use our system to analyze our raw materials, and obviously we make tires. So tires are extremely chemically complex matrices. We have multiple types of polymers, additives, resins, oils, fatty acids, plasticizers to help with processing. I mean, so many different materials. And so many of those are not good candidates for traditional GC. And a lot of them sure could be analyzed by HPLC, but the method development for a lot of those is way more intense and way more specialized, in my opinion. So raw materials alone, it's worth everything, but also rubber compounds as well. Once you put everything in there and everything's cured, again, really chemically complex matrix, which would extend to a lot of other applications as well. So, we wouldn't be able to analyze what we can with a traditional GC inlet without extractions and things like that. And then foreign material analysis, anytime you're supporting a manufacturing facility, the ability to expand your ability to analyze foreign materials is big. But another thing that Alan kind of mentioned already, but that I kind of love about this system is, we don't have a need for a headspace, for example, setup, or like a really traditional thermal desorption setup. But we can do a little bit of those types of analysis. I mean, not exactly, not traditionally, but we can approach things in a different way with our multi-shot pyrolysis system without the need for anything else that's specialized for GC inlets, because, we don't really, we don't need that kind of capacity. But I guess the versatility of the multi-shot allows us to expand even more.
Well, I definitely think you're right. One of the things that most people don't always think about is having something like Pyrolyzer is definitely going to give you that additional, not 100% that tool, but sometimes when you just kind of need to get an answer because somebody comes back at you with something and you're like, well, hold on, let me throw it in the Pyrolyzer and I'll just tell you what comes off. So,
right, and a lot of those additional things that, we'll bring up later, but some of the attachments, you can do, like volatiles. I mean, we don't have a need to analyze volatiles on a day-to-day basis, but with some of the things that we have with our multi-shot system, I can do enough of a volatiles analysis to get the answers that I need. So it's great in that regard.
Awesome. Which moves on to our next discussion point. I know we had, in setting up this webinar, we wanted to make this not just informational, but kind of talk some stories that we've seen as we've all used the systems. So one question that I have is, what are some unique uses? And Sonia, I'm going to start with you because you run pretty consistently with all kinds of samples, but have you ever been asked to run any random sample, something that wouldn't traditionally be asked about?
Sure. So I kind of already mentioned the foreign material realm and supporting manufacturing. So we do get quite a bit of requests for foreign materials, both from our plants, but also from other parts of the lab and our technical facility. And those are always really fun. I think they used to even have a foreign materials task force internal to technical just to attack those problems. But so I mentioned I also we have a microscopy lab. So our EDX system with our pyrolysis GCMS is my favorite way to approach foreign material analysis. We can identify almost anything if we really wanted to with those two tools. So some of the examples that are more fun, I guess, one that was not that recent, but they were finding kind of big clumps of foreign material on the sides of things in the plant. And they brought it in, we put it through the Pi GCMS, and we found pretty instantaneously that it was chewing tobacco, which is not a bad thing because it could have been a lot worse, I guess. We've analyzed urine. We have identified clays clogging up plumbing piping between the EDX and the pyrolysis system. We've had cases where we were able to identify the material that was clogging different gear shafts and like pins in different machine gears, both in manufacturing and in some of our other facilities. Usually it's rubber, surprise, surprise, but really easy to identify with the Pi GCMS system.
Nice.
Yeah, so I have a whole list, a long list. So foreign material is a big one. And then also in support of some of our other analysis techniques. So for example, we use NMR to do some really in-depth polymer analysis, both in rubber compounds and raw materials. We had an instance recently where the data just wasn't computing. Something wasn't coming out. Something was overlapping. So the NMR engineer brought a sample to me, and within a half an hour, we were able to identify that there was indeed an acrylonitrile polymer or material, maybe not a polymer, in there. Just in 20 minutes, we could identify that. And then in less than a day, with some standards and materials that we were able to just find around the lab, we were able to confirm kind of what that material was and why it was interfering with the sample prep. And then I'll give you one other example. So I mentioned I run our GPC. So recently I found a crystallization, an orange, like reddish crystal product that was coming out of the one column connector. And, there was no leak being detected. Everything was running fine. Data was fine. But, what was this stuff crystallizing at that joint? So I just popped it on the Pi GCMS. And sure enough, it was oxidized BHT. I could identify right away. And, it was a really minor leak that wasn't being picked up by the leak detector. And once I looked deeper into the data, it sure enough was influencing the data. But without actually identifying that, it would have taken me a while, and that problem would have become bigger. So,
no.
Yeah.
Yeah, it sounds very much like the tire version of NCIS.
Yeah, some days.
Right? We talked a little bit earlier offline. Rogine, do you want to tell the pumpkin story?
Sure, yes. So as I mentioned, I used to be a Frontier Pi GCMS user before joining Frontier. And in 1 year of my previous job, we were trying to have a Halloween party. And of course, there were multiple departments in the company, and we were trying to compete for the prize of the competition. So we decided to run pumpkin using Pi GCMS. And that's by far the most random sample that I've been running on the Pi GCMS, the actual meat, the seed, and then the skin of the pumpkin. And amazingly, we were able to see all these vitamin E type of compounds, sugar, carbohydrates. So it was pretty interesting to see how simple things, like you could run a piece of your table, keyboard, like chair, carpet, or even pumpkin, anything that you can think of, put it in your pyrolyzer and do the material characterization on it.
Nice.
Rogine,
and I know
sorry to interrupt. We have a guy in our lab who grows like all the spiciest peppers that you could imagine. And I think I'm going to bring up this year, maybe we'll throw it on the Pi GC and we can actually quantify the capsaicin.
Here we go. That would be so cool. Yes, Sonia. Yes.
we want to see those results, Sonia.
Sure. I'll send you some peppers too.
Which actually kind of runs into, I know Alan had a project recently. Do you want to talk a little bit about that? The samples that you ran?
Yes, I mean, it's kind of tough to follow up those two stories in the list of samples that you guys have run, but it was interesting because this customer was looking for looking at some fatty acid content, some suberin content actually, and they kind of glossed over what the sample was exactly, and so we didn't really have a good idea of what it was before it showed up, and we got it, and it was actually just vials of like tree bark and tree root. And that's one of the first times that I've actually had to run something complex. Most of it's been plastics and polymers and things like that. And so when I got these sample vials, there's no way I'm going to be able to run these in. And as a matter of fact, we loaded them up and we did a little bit of TMAH derivatization in the cup itself, and the chromatography came out beautiful. We actually did some pretty accurate quantitation of suberin along with some other fatty acids within these plant roots and trees, but it was overall just a little bit shocking putting actual, some type of biomatter into the cup and running it and pyrolyzing it and getting some decent results. So it actually turned out to be a pretty fun little project. So
awesome. Great, guys. So we're going to kind of close out our discussion with one more kind of point. And this, I feel like when we decided to do this kind of discussion, ask an expert, and we asked Sonia to kind of join our panel discussion here. This was actually something that you brought to us as something you were uber passionate about and kind of wanted to go over. So the discussion point is, how do you justify the purchase of this type of piece of equipment? Because, right, I mean, first of all, you've got to justify just the price of a GC or a GCMS. And now you're adding a piece of equipment that does come with a little bit of a hefty price tag. But how did you kind of go about and justify that to your company, Sonia?
So what I mentioned, I started about 3.5 years ago, and that I had no experience with GCMS before that, but we did have a single shot system from Frontier Labs. We had no auto sampler, so it was all manual injection. And I know that there was a person in the lab who was trying to justify the upgrade to the multi-shot, but they never really had much luck in method development on the system. I wonder if it was in part not having the auto sampler, but also not having the training and a dedicated, someone dedicated to the equipment. So anyway, I decided to take a short course at PitCon. Actually, it was a half-day pyrolysis course. I was about 3 or 4 months into my new position. And when I came back, there was a big manufacturing support project that I walked into. And it was so big that it was like all hands on deck. I got a call, it was Saturday morning, come in. It was a lot of money on the line, a lot of material on the line, and they basically needed very small concentration level detection of a very specific material in rubber stock. So again, really chemically complex matrix. So the approach initially was FTIR and NMR. Well, the FTIR wasn't able to quantify this particular material, and the NMR could do it. And we later found out that it could do it, but only to a certain limit of detection that actually ended up not being low enough for about 15% of the samples that came in. But the sample prep alone for the NMR method was 2 to 3 days. And there I was coming in from this short course, and I thought, well, I think we can do it with the pyrolysis system. I just learned that, we can actually do quantification. We don't do it now, but if we can make the right samples, I think we can probably have answers a lot quicker and maybe at a much smaller level of detection. So we made the samples, and sure enough, it was really promising. So it took me about 8 hours to do the proof of concept. And again, no auto sampler, the single shot system, so no ability to do the EGA.
I want to stop you right there. You said the NMR was 2 days.
For sample prep, just for the sample prep.
Yes. And you were able to do a proof of concept in 8 hours.
In 8 hours. And that included the sample prep, and that, for anyone who's worked in rubber, that's mixing, milling, weighing, mixing, milling, and curing a sample. But luckily with the Pi system, we don't need to cure special shaped samples. So it took me about 8 hours to do the proof of concept. And then it did take me about 3 to 4 days to run all of the samples. And that was me basically sitting there, because the GC method that we had was only about 10 minutes. So that was me sitting there running samples for 3 to 4 days, constantly.
Wow.
So after all, and the results, it saved the company a great deal of money. And it was a really perfect showcase for what this type of analysis can do for us, just from a manufacturing support standpoint. So I worked with my boss after that. We were able to put together a cost, time, personnel analysis of, we could have ended up doing that. So if I had the same set of samples now, I could probably set up the samples in 20 minutes, walk away, and by tomorrow I'd have all the results. So we were able to justify the purchase just from that project alone. And then since then, we've just exploded with applications now.
That's pretty amazing.
Yeah, it really was. It was a great thing to walk into also 3 months into my first job.
Can we talk about how unnerving that would be? Can you imagine starting and all of a sudden your manager comes to you and is like, wait, Sonia, I just need to let you know that you're gonna be here for the next however long, 14 days, 28 days straight until we solve this, which, right? I mean, you guys are in a plant, it's a process, like time and money, and you can't afford. I worked in my internship at a vinyl sheeting company, and if something happened in the production of that vinyl sheet, like it's literally stopped the presses, right? And you need to figure it out. So you go to your smaller mill and you're like mixing stuff up, like is the plasticizer bad or whatever, and in your case, like, you know, are all of your components good? Is there something wrong? So, but I can't even imagine my manager early on coming to me going, hey, by the way, we need you to be here to take care of this.
The pressure was definitely on. Yeah, but they didn't, you know, we really were underutilizing the system beforehand. So I don't think anyone thought I could do it, which was fine. I wasn't sure that I could either. But we actually ended up going back and optimizing that analysis because it used to be something that happened from time to time. But you know, it took me maybe a week in collaboration with the plant to optimize a test for that. And now we do it basically routinely. And
just to kind of check and make sure it doesn't happen, right?
Yep. And we need levels of detection that are lower than the NMR can provide, which is a great test for this as well. But again, it extends that range now. So that analysis and that project alone not only justified the purchase, but keeps it running.
Wow.
Yeah.
Alan, Rogine, this is going to be hard to follow up, but is there anything you guys want to add about ways people might want to use to justify the purchase of this kind of a system before we move on?
Absolutely, yes. So you had mentioned it. It is a financial commitment. We're adding a new accessory to an instrument that's already existing, or an instrument that is yet to be purchased, and that is something that is not taken lightly often. But as we've come to grow and love in this virtual world, we have done a lot better job of doing things like web demonstration. So if you'd like to see the actual hardware configuration, software, things like that, we do offer to do any type of web demos to just take a look at the system and see exactly what it would look like sitting on a bench. I think on top of that, if you still have more questions about what pyrolysis is or more application focused, besides all the webinars, Rogine and I have done many presentations together just talking about pyrolysis GCMS as a technique and how much we enjoy it and how much we love it. And then on top of that, just other areas of pre-sale support, running samples. We love to run samples here. And when we get to do it using other tools and fun things, we often jump at the opportunity. So if there is anything holding you back from justifying the purchase, please, let us know on either Rogine or myself's side. And we love to, give as much information we can about it.
Awesome. Thanks, guys. This has been
I just want to add one thing about that. I'm sorry,
Sure.
Just one thing about that. So I was able to buy everything I wanted all at once, but it is not like you can add on later. So you can buy the furnace, and then add the auto sampler, though I would say just buy the auto sampler. But then you can buy all the cool stuff later too. So it's I think they call that the turnkey. There's a phrase for that, but you don't have to spend, all of it right at once.
Good point. Yeah. One of the nice things, once you have the instrument, whether it's the GC or the GCMS, you can get the pyrolyzer. And then from having the pyrolyzer, you can upgrade to all the additional accessories, and we'll kind of come back to that. But yeah, absolutely. Good point, Sonia. It is offered as an upgradable thing. It's not something you have to have out of the gate. So, well, thanks everyone for all your thoughts on the discussion topics. Now we're going to get to some audience questions. And these first couple questions actually came from us in the previous webinars. And then we're going to jump into some questions that we've gotten. So if you haven't had a chance to ask questions and would like to get some of your questions answered, feel free to go ahead and throw those in the Q&A chat, and then we will get to them. But we're going to start off with hardware configuration, and specifically, how do you actually go about getting it configured? So I'm going to start off with Alan on this one.
Okay. Yeah, so we talked about it briefly. I think Rosina mentioned that the pyrolyzer itself fits directly on top of the and so we have a couple ways of configuring this on top of a GCMS. And the most basic and standard configuration is the pyrolyzer with furnace and or auto sampler and or other accessories on said one dedicated inlet. And that's typical for any customers purely using the instrument for pyrolysis. So if you'd like to do nothing but burn up samples all day long, then that's the instrument configuration for you, would just be the dedicated pyrolysis instrument. Our preferred configuration, at least my preferred configuration, is to have actually two separate inlets. And what we would actually have is one dedicated inlet directly plumbed up to the pyrolyzer, ready to roll. That would give you enough space to actually have the auto sampler as well. And then another inlet that's dedicated to other types of sample introduction techniques, most often just some type of liquid auto sampler. And that does actually give you enough space to have both PY with auto sampler and liquid auto sampler all on the same GC oven. It can look a little tight, but there's actually plenty of room to work with. And that's just our preference because this eliminates the need to remove the pyrolyzer and put the pyrolyzer back on. Not by any means difficult, but does eliminate that unnecessary step, keeping the pyrolyzer happy, keeping the furnace warm, not having to cool that down, and then also just making sure your inlet consumables are separate as well. As we know, depending on sample prep or lack thereof, pyrolysis can be a destructive technique, of course, and this kind of separates our analyses to make sure that our inlets are staying completely separate and dedicated as well.
And just since we have you, Sonia, and you have these systems, how are your systems currently configured?
So I ended up keeping our single shot system when we upgraded to the multi-shot, and we're really lucky that we have two GCMSs. So the one, I put the single shot in its own dedicated inlet, and then I have a liquid inlet on the same instrument with an auto sampler. So again, I don't have an auto sampler on the single shot pyrolyzer. So I run that one manually, but like Alan said, there's definitely room. I could add it, and we've thought about adding one. Really easy to switch back and forth using some kind of vent-free adapter, so you don't have to vent your mass spec, or if you have the time, I guess you could do that. But it's really easy to go back and forth. Now with the single shot system, I'm not running as many samples on that now that I have the multi-shot with the auto sampler. It's kind of like, I don't really look back. But it is nice to have for maybe if somebody else in the lab wants to use it, or if I'm running other things on the multi-shot. So I'm glad I kept it, and it works really well having both. And then my multi-shot system, I have just, it's the only inlet on that GCMS. And I really prefer it that way for my needs, and that's because I'm running it quite often. I'm doing a lot more specialized things now with the new system, so I really prefer having just the one inlet if you're going to be using the Pi system a lot.
Awesome, thanks. Next question, and this one's going to be for Alan and Rosine. What's the advantage of using Pi GC or GCMS versus other analytical techniques? And specifically, Alan, we'll start with you. What would be the advantage of using the pyrolyzer versus like a thermal desorption unit or doing TGA?
Right. And so I kind of mentioned this a little bit earlier, but more specifically going into detail about PY versus TD. So depending on whether or not you're using a dedicated thermal desorption sampler or not, the biggest thing first and foremost is temperature, max temperature. Most thermal desorption units don't reach nearly a high enough temperature to provide any type of pyrolysis information. On top of that, I'd say one of the biggest things, and we may get to this in a question that I just saw come in, but something about the sample prep. Typically, the sample required for PY is a lot less than most other sample introduction techniques, whether it be thermal desorption or headspace. similar to what I said earlier about the TGA, right? We can do some type of pseudo TGA where we see what comes off at certain temperature ramps, but just adding that capability to a GC or GCMS gives us the necessary means to an end of kind of figuring out what that material is, characterization. But then we also have the ability to run thermal desorption as well on the pyrolysis unit. So it doesn't require two separate sample introduction techniques. We can just do all of this with one sample introduction technique, and that's what proves the most beneficial.
Perfect. And Rogine, I'm going to take you to what about the difference between pyrolysis versus FTIR?
Well, as a chemist, I have to admit every instrumentation is a great tool, right, in your toolbox. So I completely kind of on the same page that every instrumentation will bring a unique advantage to your laboratory. Based on my experience, when I was performing FTIR versus PyGCMS, first of all, sample preparation was #1 challenge with FTIR because I had to perform a lot of solvent extraction or sample pretreatment before doing the analysis, versus with PyGC, you just place it inside your cup, even solid liquid, and you can just do the analysis. The second advantage I can think of is the mask picking, how FTIR in some cases can suffer from mask picking, which means if there are 1 or 2 compounds in a mixture that they have the same dipolar moment, they might absorb IR rays and a same or a nearby IR wavelength. So that's very challenging for you to be able to distinguish those compounds that they coelute at the same time, or they absorb the same IR wavelength. This actually brought up to an example of our ASTM method for quantifying phthalates in a PVC matrix, and how some of the plasticizer and phthalates, they coelute from one another. So they are exactly coming from the same retention time. But what you do with the PyGCMS, you go after a unique quantification ion, enable to be extracting to kind of be able to extract those different ions and be able to extract and say this compound is distinguishable or differentiate from one another, and being able to do the quantitative analysis on them.
Awesome. Great. Thanks, Rogine. You kind of brought this up in this comment. Let's talk a little bit about what are some typical sample prep considerations. Rogine, I'm going to start with you, and then I'm going to move on to Sonia. But let's kind of continue on with your sample prep considerations.
Okay. Well, one of the #1 comments that I hear back from our customer, and that's I think one of the #1 challenges for them, is they think the more they put inside their sample cup, the better analysis they're going to get. But actually it's the other way around. The less amount of sample you put inside your sample cup, the better analysis you're going to get, mainly because of the sensitivity and selectivity of your MS in this case. But also sampling size when you're doing sample preparation is very important. We typically suggest somewhere between 50 to 200, 250 micrograms. And the reason it's a broad range is depending on your application. Say, if you're doing bulk pyrolysis, which is complete pyrolysis, you're going to heat up your furnace at a pretty high temperature, then you don't want to go more than 200 or 250 microgram unless you know that your sample contains a lot of inorganics. Because again, remember, with PyGCMS, you're going to analyze the organic portion of your sample, and all the non-thermal active or the inorganic is going to stay inside your cup. But if you're doing analysis on coatings and additives, especially in ppm and trace amount of concentration for your additives, you could place a little bit more sample inside your cup, again, in a way that range between 50 to 250 microgram. One thing I also want to mention about the importance of sampling size and placing proper amount of sample inside your cup because of the thermodynamic cooling effect. So as you guys know, the more sample you put inside your sample cup, the more energy and heat is needed for that sample to get pyrolyzed in a proper way, in an optimal pyrolysis. We call it an even pyrolysis and optimal temperature. Now, if you place too much sample and fill up your cup all the way with powder, solid sample that are not really needed for you to overload your system, then that sample requires more heat in order for it to get pyrolyzed. And of course, you're not applying that amount of heat. You set in your furnace at an optimal temperature. So this is called the thermodynamic cooling effect, where there is less temperature that is actually needed for your sample in order to get pyrolyzed. So the tip here is don't overload your system. Do not pour too much amount of sample inside your sampling cup. Stick between 50 to 250 microgram of the samples.
Perfect. And Sonia, what do you think about when you think about sample prep? I know we kind of talked beforehand about, just kind of cut it up and throw it in and call it a day. But what kind of sample prep considerations do you have to take with the samples that you run?
Yeah, that's a good question. So I mentioned before we really improved our PyGCMS methods and kind of workflow. We used to just chuck some in. And that resulted in a lot of maintenance for our mass spec, which is fine. It was just unnecessary. So a microbalance is really, I think, a must-have. I bought a really cheap microbalance. It's probably not the most accurate. Well, I think it's accurate, but I don't know if the precision margin's a little higher. It doesn't have as tight of a tolerance, but it has definitely improved our ability to sample consistently and to reduce our mass spec maintenance time. So weighing that sample is everything. Also, I find that sometimes we still have to worry about homogenization, especially for samples like rubber that are so heterogeneous. Sometimes, I can sample on one end of a sample specimen and then on the other end, and I'll get different results. And it's not because the pyrolyzer is not doing its job, it's because there's just a different amount of analyte. So sometimes I do have to consider maybe cryo grinding a sample or chopping up a lot of sample and like mixing it and then sampling from that. And then it depends on your mass spec system, I guess. We use the QP 2010 series, and I would say it's still pretty sensitive. I know that the 2020, I think, is much more sensitive, but we do thermal desorption on samples that are about 200 micrograms for analytes that are maybe like a half a weight percent, maybe 0.2 weight percent, and we get really good results. Sometimes we have to use like selective ion monitoring, which is fine. But we try not to put any more than about 200 micrograms in anymore.
All right.
Nicole, I would love to add something to Sonia's comment if that's possible, if you have the time.
Yeah, sure.
Actually, Sonia, you mentioned a great point about homogeneity of the samples, right? And we actually have a technical note regarding our phallic ASTM again, how we are analyzing a duck sample. And that duck sample is a plastic toy sample, contain multiple colors. And every color or portion of the toy has a different ppm level of the regulated phallic. So one way to approach it, as you mentioned, if it's possible, make it into powder. So the smaller pieces you place inside your cup, the better result you're going to get. But also another approach is, we call it a thin film approach, which means, if possible, dissolve your solid sample or powder into a solvent, inject a few drops liquid inside the cup, let the solvent evaporate from the solution, and you end up with a thin film at the bottom inside your cup. And that really, really improves your quantitation work. Of course, if the sample is possible for you to dissolve it in some type of a solvent.
No, it really is. So I started doing that after I went to the training at Diablo Analytical, and I opt to do that more often these days. It's much easier. And like a micropipette, just a plastic micropipette tip fits fine. You can dispense like really easily into the cups, or a micro syringe. Very easy. Mm-hmm.
Okay. So we have about 10 minutes left.
Can I jump in
real
quick?
Go ahead, Alan.
Just because it kind of ties into a question that I just recently saw come in regarding the sample prep. So both Sonia and Rojin touched on it. We are not just limited to solid sampling here as well. We can also do liquid sampling, and we also do our art adjustments and things like that, our alkane mixes through the pyrolysis unit, just because we can simply inject a liquid into the cup, let the solvent dissipate, and then run it at the analysis as such. So, but talking about sample prep kind of caught my eye with the question that's in the queue right now about the lower detection limits. And same with any analysis, there's going to be a lot of factors that go into this. As Rogine and Sonia have mentioned, the sample size, actually how much we put in there. Sometimes more is not always better. But the pyrolysis unit, if you heat it up appropriately and you put sample in the cup, it is going to all go to the GCMS. So pyrolysis as a technique is going to be as sensitive as your GCMS is, because we are just simply heating up the sample and sending all of the analytes to the GCMS. So the lower detection limits are going to be close to what your lower detection limits of just a standard GCMS are, but with some matrix interference you may not be able to hit as low as you might think, but we're still talking lower ppms, even ppb level work here with the detection limits for pyrolysis and GCMS.
Awesome. Thanks, Ellen. We do have a couple more questions that I want to make sure we get through. This one's kind of quick answer. What is your favorite accessory or must-have optional piece? And I'm going to start with Alan.
Yes. So if you were not able to check out the other two webinars, one of the favorite things that I talked about, it was touched on in the first one, and I covered an application on it in the second one, is the UV absorber. That's right, UV. So what this attachment does is it exposes your sample to UV light for extended periods of time. This opens up so many cool, fun applications as far as weather degradation, just the breakdown of plastics in the atmospheric conditions, so we can actually change the gas that's in the furnace to air and expose it to UV light. It's hands down one of my favorite things in the world, just because it's so much fun to see how those samples react to light. On top of that, kind of more of a basic accessory that's usually included in most, but some people overlook, is the selective sampler. So having the ability to selectively sample things either towards the GCMS or out the vent is crucial, especially when running samples that have a kind of dirty matrix, because we don't always want that going to the inlet or the head of the column or the GCMS. So it's nice to actually be able to cut pieces and parts of the chromatogram out and send it out to vent.
Nice. Rogine, what about you? What's your favorite or must-have accessory?
I would say it really depends on the application. But for example, if we're doing something that we are going after volatiles or light compounds, say you're doing quantitative analysis on a styrene or, it's reactive monomer, microjet cryotrap is my favorite one, using liquid nitrogen. First of all, it's cool to use liquid nitrogen in the lab and just focus and sharp peaks of the MJT at the front of the chromatogram that you could observe.
Nice.
Yeah,
and Sonia, what about you?
Really cool. The cryotrap is really cool. I'm glad we got it. But for me, it's the auto sampler. It's a must. I mean, all of the other things are great, but if you can't automate it, you're going to end up hating the cryotrap if you have to run it manually and UV. The auto shot is a must.
Awesome. Another question that came in, and we kind of had a conversation about touching on this. What do you guys think about libraries? And I'm going to start with Sonia, because you have kind of a short story to tell about libraries. So what do you guys think about the libraries that are available?
I was lucky to be able to include the F-Search in our initial purchase. Again, that's something you can buy later if you need to, but if you can, it's definitely worth the investment. It is kind of an expensive library, but again, worth the investment. So beforehand, we're just using the NIST libraries and then a Wiley library, and then a kind of homemade library for our mass spec, a spectral library. Pyrolysis products are not very vast in those libraries. And then also the F-Search allows you to build your own GC library, which has been a huge, a really cool thing that we underutilize still. We've had our system now for over a year, and I'm just really building that, but extremely useful to be able to build your own GC and mass spectral libraries.
Nice. And then I'm going to kind of close out one last question here, and tried to make it somewhat of a fun question. So thinking back, so you're all experts. That's why we asked you to be on the panel here. We have multiple years of experience using the pyrolyzer system. The age-old question, if you knew then what you knew now, or what would you tell your younger, uninformed pyrolysis self? What advice would you give yourself as someone new starting in pyrolysis? What kind of things would you tell yourself? So I'll start with Alan. What would you tell your younger self?
One thing that obviously over and over again, and it's true by the auto sampler, as someone who has suffered doing manual sample preparation, like manual SPME, holding my hand above a vial for 15 minutes just by the auto sampler, it's going to change your life in the long run, and just also give you the ability to run as many samples as possible. I would say next, kind of a gut check for me was, it doesn't matter how good of a chemist you think you are, you may not always know the right temperatures to run the program at. There's no shame in starting with the EGA and working from the beginning and moving up from EGA to single shot to double shot to hard cut, as much as you think that you know where things are going to come off at, or you have this paper that told you this, that, and the third. I would say just start from the EGA. If you have no idea what it is, there is no problem. And you'll actually learn a lot more along the way about different polymers and plastic samples, and start to kind of remember those temperature programs. But starting with the EGA, starting from scratch, doing the necessary method development is something that I wish I would have learned when I first started, or someone would have forced me to do.
Told you ahead of time. All right, Regine, what about you? What would you tell your younger self?
Probably I would tell, do not underestimate the power of this system. It's one instrument, right? But you can actually use it in a very, multiple different techniques. You can customize it to your own application. And as Alan mentioned, every mode of operation really can add value to your laboratory. Could be EGA, of thermal profile, then thermal desorption, flash pyrolysis. So try to play around and try to learn and use different modes of operation of the system.
Nice. And Sonia, last but certainly not least, what would you tell your younger self?
To go to the training. You know, you have to be able to conduct routine maintenance. You have to be able to keep your GC inlet leak free. You have to be able to clean your mass spec. You know, if you're not well trained, you'll underutilize any system. And then one of the biggest things that I took from the training when I went for the pyrolysis training, and a tool I wish I would have had the day I first started at Cooper, was that book, Regine. I actually have it behind me. The Frontier, it's like the GCMS. Hold on. I'm going to plug this book. It's backwards, but it's the GCMS data book of synthetic polymers. And it's, I mean, if you don't want to buy the F-Search, at least buy this book. It's a library of most common polymers analyzed by PyGCMS. I use it almost every day. You can see I have tons of tabs in it. And I wish I would have had it the day I started at Cooper.
Absolutely.
That's a great thing.
Just to add to the training side as well from our end, obviously that Sonia said, the training, that's something that we all also strive to do, especially with everything being virtual now. So we're working on setting up a few satellite, I don't want to say campuses, but, areas at which we will have pyrolysis units on top of a GCMS across the country. And we're looking forward to having those sites up and operational and make those available for training, not only for our internal people, but for the customers as well, because that's the end user. That's the most important part. And so we hope to have some sites up and running soon.
Awesome. Well, it looks like we are just a little over an hour. So does anybody want to have any final thoughts, any parting knowledge you guys want to send our viewers out with?
Terry Ramos at the pyrolysis training said, when I was there, he said that if you can pick up this technique and utilize it to help your company, you will really make a name for yourself where you work. And he's really right. The applications are endless, and you can really help your team and your company if you can really learn how to apply this technique.
Alan, Rogine, any other final thoughts?
As Alan mentioned, we work very closely together. So if you guys need to justify the purchase, or we are here to help in any way we could, seminar, virtual demos, presentation, lunch and learns, or even running samples for you guys.
Yeah, I would say that's all that I have. Yeah, any type of, even if you want to just chop shop about applications you think you might want to run, we'd love to chat, and I'm always up for new ideas and new applications. So.
And just as we're closing out here, for those who haven't had a chance, if you check out the speaker bios, which should be down in the bottom toolbar here, you will have access to everybody's email address. So if you want to know anything more about what any of us have done with pyrolysis, questions about not just pyrolysis, but GC or GCMS, as Alan mentioned, if you want to spitball some application thoughts, we love chatting about the instrumentation. Whether it's Shimadzu, Frontier, we just like talking instrumentation. So definitely, if you have questions, please feel free to reach out to us. So before we close, first of all, I do want to thank our expert panel, Alan, Rogine, Sonia. You guys have been great. I hope we can do this again. I hope this was informative for all of our viewers over the internet here. But just before we close, quick few announcements. If you missed any of our series, this was the third, count them third one in the series. If you missed the others, we will be putting a link to register. It will be posted on the Shimadzu website, www.ssi.shimadzu.com. And also, we have a few other webinars that are going to be coming up. In fact, this week, if you are available on Thursday, we will be doing a GCMS thermal desorption webinar. And then on April 1st, no joke, we will be having another pyrolysis webinar, another customer of ours that's going to be presenting. And then finally, I'm sorry, Rogine, shameless plug, but we will be doing an FTIR microscopy webinar on April 27th at 2 p.m., specifically on microplastics. And if nothing else, you should check it out, because I know the IR isn't quite as great as the pyrolyzer, but I think the microscopy technique is kind of a cool thing to do. When you have kind of the whole suite of instruments, Sonia, I think you kind of brought this up. I think it really does kind of round out what you need in the lab. Things like the pyrolyzer, GCMS, NMR, the FTIR with the microscope. It gets you everything that you need. So again, I want to thank all of our viewers at home, as well as our expert panel. This has been great. Thank you very much for checking us out, and it's been great. Have a great day, everyone.
Everyone.
Bye, everyone.
Bye.